Hello, my name is John Hilke, and I'm going to be providing you with a little introduction to Unitarian Universalism and to Unitarian Universalist history in particular. In order to do that, I'm going to share PowerPoint slides with you. Our session will be in two parts. So the first part we'll get started with just immediately here. So before I get started on talking you through the slides, I wanted to express some gratitude to Reverend James Ishmael Ford for giving us permission to borrow a couple portions of a sermon that he gave in 2019. So the first question you might ask is, why look at Unitarian Universalist history? Well, to understand why that might be useful, it's good to know that Unitarian Universalism is a living religious tradition, which means that it keeps evolving with our understanding, new knowledge, and new ideas. So in order to be part of that ongoing conversation about theology and ethics and healing the world that are typical of UU congregations, it helps to know a little bit about how this faith tradition emerged and developed over the centuries. And before we get started, I'll also want to thank you for considering becoming part of this story. I'm going to start out with 9 sort of basics that I'm in hopes that you've already encountered or that you will encounter soon if you're just getting started with a Unitarian Universalist congregation. So the first one is Unitarian Universalism as a liberal religion that entails a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And this search for truth and meaning constitutes the living tradition of Unitarian Universalism. As you might suspect, once you're looking for truth and it keeps changing, it's important not to have any barriers to that. And so the second one is, accordingly, UU congregations do not assert any creed. When I was a kid growing up in a UU congregation, there used to be a little joke about the interest of Unitarians in talking about things with each other. And according to the joke, people were lining up to go to heaven, and there was a small sign along the way that said, to heaven one direction and to discussion of heaven the other. The UU is generally lined up behind the discussion to heaven sign, since that was a greater interest. The third basic is that UU congregations in North America in particular lift up 7 principles, which we've established relatively recently, actually, and identified 6 sources of inspiration and insight. And as I said, these were developed relatively recently in the 1980s. Fourth, when you get involved with the congregation, you may find that they have some sort of statement about how the members hope to relate to each other, to the congregation, and to the world at large. And this is sometimes called the congregation's covenant. And sometimes Unitarian Universalism is referred to as a covenantal religion as opposed to a religion of creed. So here are the actual list of the principles: the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, the acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and finally, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Students of the 7 principles and the way they're stated, note that there are some contrasting elements to it. So you might look at the first principle, which is focused on individual responsibility and worth, versus the 7th principle, which focuses on the interdependence of all creatures. So this is basically a and note that life is not always one thing or the other, but may have holding up values which seemingly contradict each other, but which are actually truisms, and you live life in between those two. The fifth point is that Unitarian Universalism, both of those were originally separate religious traditions, and they were both stemming from liberal Christianity. However, these days, most UUs look to a variety of religious and philosophical traditions for inspiration. And notably, Francis David, who was one of the very earliest passionate Unitarian preachers, famously said, "You need not think alike to love alike. Therefore, love rather than belief is at the heart of Unitarian Universalism." And this was a statement which was made nearly 500 years ago and remains true today. Number 6 is that UU congregations in North America operate on the basis of what we call congregational polity, which means that the ultimate authority in the congregation rests with the congregants themselves, rather than having some hierarchical system of bishops or other folks who supervise the congregation. Number 7, many UU individuals and congregations, as well as the denomination, which is called the Unitarian Universalist Association, have a strong commitment to work for social and environmental justice, and that comes in many forms. And they view this as an integral part of being a welcoming and compassionate religious community. So it's integrated into the entire operation and viewpoints of the congregations and the denomination. Number 8, there are about 100, well, there are over 1,000 UU congregations in North America with a total of about 200,000 participants. That's adults and kids. There are indications from surveys that a lot more folks self-identify as UUs, even though they don't attend regularly. Number 9, there are Unitarian Universalist congregations around the world, but they have different forms of governance and religious practices which reflect their different histories. The oldest congregations in the world are in the ethnic Hungarian cities and towns in modern-day Romania. We'll learn a little bit about why that is. So to get started, this is just a sort of an overview slide to talk about some of the things we'll be getting to during the course of this presentation. So up in the left-hand corner there, this is the All Souls Unitarian Church in Washington, D.C. So we'll learn about a little bit about some individual UU congregations and their histories. We'll learn about the flaming chalice, which is the symbol of Unitarian Universalism. We'll learn about the UUA, which is the denominational organization, and the folks there were the officers of the UUA in 2019. We'll learn a little bit about the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee and other work for social justice, which is represented here by the Sharps. We'll learn a little bit more about their story. The guy with the ruffles on the lower level is Michael Servetus. He was really the first person to articulate Unitarian or anti-Trinitarian views. We'll learn about what happened to him and what he was, a little bit about what he was like. And the last person on the bottom row there is Clara Barton, famous for founding the Red Cross in the United States. She's also very reflective of this combination between the theologies of Unitarianism and Universalism and the work for social justice. So as mentioned earlier, the roots of Unitarianism and Universalism are in liberal Christianity, but this actually is not something of recent vintage at all, but goes way, way back to the very beginnings of Christianity. Unitarianism traces its roots to Bishop Arius, who disputed the Trinity. However, in 325 at the Council of Nicaea, the Emperor Constantine declared Trinitarianism to be the accepted doctrine, so Unitarianism became a heresy at that point. One little irony of history is that apparently Constantine also had some relatives who were Arians, and towards the very end of his life, he decided, well, maybe I had been wrong about adopting the Trinitarian viewpoint, and he tried to roll it back, but there wasn't enough time to get it organized. Universalism reaches back to the work of Origen of Alexandria. The basic doctrine here was that God was so good that ultimately all people would be reconciled with God. This was declared a heresy in 543 AD under the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. So there's a long, long gap between these very earliest religious thinkers and the actual revival of these two theologies, which really awaited until the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment eras in Europe. So there's a good point for a small story. You may know that Pope John the 23rd was the reform-oriented Roman Catholic pontiff during the 60s. And one of his major steps was to call the Vatican II conference, at which he invited many other religious leaders to attend. And at Vatican II, he actually met Reverend Dana Greeley, who was the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And he, in his greeting, and it helps to know that John the 23rd was a guy who frequently had a sort of twinkle in his eye, to know that he was very friendly and had a little humor in his life, but at the same time, many of the things he said had a serious side. So he said to Dana Greeley, oh, I see you created a religion out of all of our heresies. And that might be an accurate summary of how we got to where we are. So the rebirth of anti-Trinitarianism really is due to Michael Servetus. It helps to know that he was born in Spain, I think we believe in 1511, which was just after the Christians in Spain had reunited the country and driven out the Jews and the Muslims. The picture in the right of this slide is actually a picture of me in Geneva. This was taken about 1990, and this is the monument in Geneva to Michael Servetus. So Michael Servetus was a really brilliant person, but really argumentative. He was versed in many, many fields. So one of his specialties was using the original languages to read the Bible. And when he did that, it resulted in the publication of his first book, which was called The Errors of the Trinity. He was all of 21 years old when he wrote that book. And it's really interesting to note that he really objected to the Trinity for two reasons. One is he didn't find any support in the Bible for it. And second, he felt that the Trinity was an obstacle to Christians being able to convert Jews and Muslims, because they wouldn't even start to listen to you if you weren't also a monotheistic religion. Well, as you might guess, attacking the Trinity in the 1500s was not a way to win a popularity contest with the Inquisition. And Servetus was forced to flee, and he went to France. There he developed a profession as a physician, actually. And he's actually fairly famous in medical circles because he was the first European to describe the human circulatory system. All through this period, he was in conversation by letter with lots of other reformers, religious reformers at the time, including John Calvin. But their relationship became more and more bitter over time, and eventually bitter enough that John Calvin betrayed Servetus to the Inquisition. So Servetus managed to escape the Inquisition, and he thought he had found a place where he might find some supporters and be sheltered in northern Italy. But for some reason or other, on his way there from France, he stopped at Geneva and at a church service, all ironic perhaps, he was identified. They arrested him. They interrogated him for some 75 days and then burned him at the stake in 1553. So that was a rocky start for Unitarianism in the modern era. But I wanted to tell you about this little story from Scotland, which is related. So the last book that Servetus wrote was called The Restoration of Christianity. And this was actually the book in which he described the circulatory system. Everybody thought that there were only 2 copies left in the world because the Inquisition had basically burned a lot of the volumes along with Servetus, but it also destroyed other ones. But it turns out that there was actually an additional copy, and it was in Scotland and given to the University of Edinburgh at one point and then seemingly lost in their archives for about 200 years and then found again. The minister of my church near Washington, D.C., Roger Fritz, took a sabbatical to Edinburgh, and he was actually allowed to look at this copy of The Restoration of Christianity, and he was actually allowed to look at, thumb through the pages, and he found that there was a section of pages, about 10 of them, that had been razored out of the book. And his first reaction was, oh my goodness, isn't this a tragedy? But then he realized what he was probably seeing was the original copy that had belonged to Calvin. That those pages were the pages which had been razored out by Calvin, sent to the Inquisition to have them go after Servetus. So how on earth could you have this connection? Well, it turns out that if Calvin basically didn't burn his copy and kept it, and then when Calvin died, it probably went to his primary student, who was John Knox. And John Knox was the founder of the Scottish National Church, which is a Calvinist denomination. And it's John Knox, who gave the book to the University of Edinburgh. Well, to understand the history after the death of Servetus, it helps to look at a map of Europe, and this is the map of around 1570. You'll see several things that look very strange compared to what a modern map looks like. You'll see that Geneva and Milan, which was the area that Servetus was headed toward, were both part of the Holy Roman Empire at that point. But if you look in Eastern Europe, it's a very, very different map. The most immediate thing you might recognize is that Poland and Lithuania, which are fairly small countries these days, were huge at this period of time. They went almost up to Moscow and south almost all the way to the Black Sea. So Poland and Lithuania were joined in a single country. And then below that, you'll see an area that's labeled as Transylvania. And next to Transylvania, you'll see another area with the stripes that's in red. Well, this is what was left of Hungary at this period of time in history. And sometimes those 2 parts were united, and other parts they were separate. And we'll be talking mostly about the Transylvania section of Hungary at that point. So this is a relatively complicated story. I'm going to try to do it quickly and give you some pictures to maybe help you keep in mind how the story goes. So Bonus Sforza was a member of the royal family in Milan. And She, at around age 30, was married to King John Sigismund I of Poland and Lithuania. And when she went from Milan to Poland, she took her doctor with her. His name was Giorgio Biandrati. And Biandrati was actually somebody who um, was very positive about Servetus's work about the Trinity. So she went to Poland, and when she arrived, her thought patterns began to become less and less traditional, and this may have been due to Biandrati's influence on her, but it also is probably the case that her own thought process was changing over time. She had a daughter whose name was Isabella, and Isabella married King John Sigismund I of Hungary. And at that time, Hungary included both the blue and yellow striped areas. And but shortly after she was married and they had a child together, who ended up being King John Sigismund II, she was driven from the throne, and there was a lot of intrigue about how she would be regent or not regent. And one of the deciding factors in all that ended up being her relationship to Suleiman the Magnificent, who was the emperor of the Ottoman Empire at the time. The middle picture there is an event called the Diet of Torda. And in that situation, there was basically a contest, which John Sigismund had called, in which the various religious groups within the country got to argue with each other about what the king should believe. And after the diet, after this debate, the king decided that he would become a Unitarian, and he's the only Unitarian king in history. And Francis David was the person who was preaching in this picture and sort of won the king over. It's believed that Biandrati and Francis David basically worked together to accomplish this conversion of the king. The most important parts of the history of early Unitarianism have to do with this diet at Torda and the subsequent events. So this is basically telling you what I just told you, but there's a couple extra things which I need to mention. So the reason why Isabella was able to retain the regency and bring up her son to take the throne was that she had a relationship with Suleiman the Magnificent and had actually allowed her son to have Suleiman the Magnificent as his godfather, effectively. So it was the insistence of Suleiman which allowed the regency to go forward and for King John Sigismund to be crowned. One of the things that Isabella decided, and which was novel and for which she and John Sigismund II are probably most famous, is that they were the first monarchs in Europe to issue edicts of religious toleration. She believed that that would be one way to help secure her throne and reduce the amount of religious conflict. And when her son came to the throne, he reconfirmed her original decree. So once John Sigismund had been converted to Unitarianism, a lot of Unitarian churches were formed in the country. But John Sigismund didn't live long after that. He died at the age of 30 in 1571. And the circumstances were kind of suspicious, but never proven. After he died, there was a lot of concern in the Unitarian churches about whether they would survive or not, because the incoming king was not Unitarian, and they understood that in all likelihood the Catholic Habsburg family would ultimately take over the country. So Biandrati actually did some bargaining, and they reached an agreement with the incoming king that would provide legal protection to the Unitarian churches, but they had to freeze their theology. And Francis David was opposed to that deal, and Biandrati basically had him imprisoned, and he died in prison. So that was the early story. At the same time, or slightly after the events in Transylvania, there also became a fairly widespread Unitarian movement within Poland. And Faustus Socinus, which was the picture that I previously showed you, but failed to talk about, Faustus Socinus was the leader of this group, and he was actually Italian and came from the same general part of Italy as Bona Sforza had done and Biandrati. So there definitely was a society, a social thing going on in northern Italy, which was reform-oriented, more favorable to the Reformation and to other religious ideas. However, the Unitarians in Poland sort of lost out on the political battles, and they were banished from Poland in 1658. However, not all was lost. A lot of publishers in Holland and later in England took up some of the ideas that Servetus and Socinus had developed, including one of the publishers being a grandson of Socinus. Once these ideas got to England, they found some support amongst leading academics of the time. And even though it was illegal to be Unitarian, both Sir Isaac Newton and John Locke had sympathies in this direction. And the papers of Sir Isaac Newton, which were actually became public in the 1930s, show lots and lots of pages of discussion about anti-Trinitarian thought and lack of support for the Trinity in the Bible. Within England, there began to be churches who identified as Unitarian and Universalist, although they didn't use the name. And some of those clergy folks were Anglicans, on the liberal side of Anglican clergy. Some were people who worshipped at the Church of the Stranger in London. And then there were also some independent congregations where the clergy adopted Unitarian or Universalist views. And there's a small list of folks there. Unitarianism didn't get legalized in England until 1813. So that's a long time of suppression. So although most of our story is now going to go over to the United States, I did think it would be appropriate to include a little bit about Unitarianism in Europe after the banishment from Poland. So here we have on the left the Unitarian headquarters in Cluj or Kosovar. And the next three pictures are all English Unitarians, very prominent people in the 1800s. Florence Nightingale, basically working for the betterment of treatment of soldiers who were wounded. Charles Darwin, the developer of the whole theory of evolution. And Charles Dickens, who is famous for lots of stories and so forth, but many of them are related to social justice issues, and all three of those were Unitarians. There was also a small Unitarian congregation in Copenhagen, and Edvard Grieg was part of that group. There's a very interesting and quite relatively recent connection between Unitarianism and Czechoslovakia. So Thomas Masaryk, who's pictured here on the far left at the bottom, was the first president of Czechoslovakia. He actually was in the United States and came in contact with Unitarians, and they are allegedly the group that brought him in contact with President Wilson. And after World War I, Masaryk was involved in the creation of Czechoslovakia and became its first president. We'll also learn a little bit later more about Reverend Norbert Capek, who's pictured the next one over to Masaryk. And the picture in the middle there is Unitaria, the church in Prague, which is Unitarian. And before the war, before World War II, Unitaria was the largest Unitarian church in the world. They had some 3,000 members. The next person over is Robert Burns, who's often associated with the revival of Scottish nationalism and interest in Scottish culture. He was a Unitarian. And the last person on the right in the bottom row is Bela Bartok, a famous musician. I put him here because not only was he Unitarian, but the fact that his children and grandchildren were willing to be elected as presidents of the Unitarian churches helped protect them all through the 1900s, including during the communist era. So I'm calling this slide Crossing the Pond and Fomenting the American Revolution. So within the Americas, there were some resident ministers who started having second thoughts about the Trinity and about predestination. And then there were several religious figures from England who came to the US basically fleeing from the rules against Unitarianism and Universalism in England. So there's a quick list here. Mayhew and Murray was from England. James Freeman, we'll learn a little bit about him later. Joseph Priestley, the famous scientist as well as minister, and then a whole series of people who were deeply involved in the revolution and the formation of the United States, and particularly the parts of the Constitution which prevent establishment of a religion within the United States. So Universalism really owes its origins in the United States to Hosea Ballou. And he was originally a Baptist minister and converted to Universalism. He founded many Universalist congregations and he organized the denomination. He was a very persuasive preacher, and he convinced the Universalists to reject creedal tests and to reject the doctrine of the Trinity. He emphasized the use of reason in religion, and he believed in congregational polity. So all that work made it much, much easier for the Universalists and the Unitarians to ultimately join in 1961, a long, long time later. On the Unitarian side, much of the credit for the organized Unitarianism goes to Reverend William Ellery Channing. He was a major Congregationalist minister in Boston whose views gradually changed over time to reject the Trinity and to reject predestination. He's given credit for really organizing an understanding of what Unitarianism meant as opposed to Congregationalism. And he did that in a famous sermon in Baltimore. The other thing that we really remember Channing for is the theological position, which he called salvation by character. And this was an articulation of the rejection of the predestination. Predestination said that, if you were rich, it was because God meant you to be rich. If you were poor, God meant you to be poor, and you should just be satisfied with it. Channing believed that people had their own agency, that they could improve their lot in life by self-study and by basically trying to be a good person. And it wasn't too far from accepting that notion to accepting the notion that you might have some obligation to help improve your society as well as yourself. So the earliest Universalist church was founded by John Murray in Gloucester. King's Chapel, which had been the first Episcopal church in the United States, well, and I wouldn't say the United States yet, in the colonies, became Unitarian in 1785 through the work of Reverend James Freeman. He was the minister and sort of went to the deacons and said, well, you're probably going to have to fire me because I don't believe in the Trinity anymore. And their response sort of surprised him and said, well, we don't really either. So why don't we just delete all the references to the Trinity in our common prayer book, and then we'll all be on the same page. The earliest congregation that took the name Unitarian was founded by Joseph Priestley, and that was in Northumberland, Pennsylvania in 1794. Although there were these various sort of startups from a few congregations, the real launch of Unitarianism came through a schism within the Congregationalist Church. The Congregationalist Church was a place which encompassed all the established churches in New England, and there was some resistance to predestination and Trinitarianism even as early as the mid-1700s. And Jonathan Mayhew, one of the prominent ministers in Boston, was one of the chief agitators along those lines. The dissent really got going, however, in the early 1800s when the managers of Harvard appointed a Unitarian to an endowed divinity school scholar professorship. And within a few years after that, some 250 congregations broke away from the Congregationalist Church to become Unitarian. And the ministers from these individual congregations formed the American Unitarian Association in 1825. And it's probably good to at least recognize that the Unitarian Universalist Association is still headquartered in Boston. One of the jokes used to be about Unitarianism. It was the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of Jesus, and the neighborhood of Boston. It's not quite so true anymore, but that was true for quite a while. One of the things which is I find fun to do, and which you might want to do at some point too, is as you're traveling around, visit some of the higher profile UU churches. It's you learn a lot, and it's also quite interesting. So up on the top row, we've got the Arlington Street Church in Boston, which is where the congregation where Channing was the minister. King's Chapel in Boston is the next one over. It's on the Freedom Trail in Boston if you're playing tourist. The next one over is the Charleston, South Carolina Unitarian Universalist Church, which is just an absolutely gorgeous building. The final one on the top row is the Fourth Universalist Church in New York City, sometimes called the Universalist Cathedral. On the bottom row, we've got two Frank Lloyd Wright churches, the one in Madison and the Unity Temple, the ones on the extremes. You'll recognize All Souls Unitarian Church again. This was this church in Washington, D.C. And John Adams was one of the original members of that church. The next one over is the Unitarian Church in Quincy, Massachusetts, where both John Adams and John Quincy Adams and their spouses are buried. So that brings us to our intermission, and I hope you've enjoyed this, learned a little bit. There'll be a second part, which sort of takes up the story after this. But during the intermission, I'll invite you to listen to some lovely music. This is a quite interesting performance by the Atlanta UU Congregations Choir, and it's actually performing a cappella at the headquarters of the Unitarian Church in Romania. So I'm going to stop this slideshow and go to that video in just a second. Hello, this is John Hilke again. I'm ready to start part 2 of our overview of Unitarian Universalist history. Again, I'm going to share the screen and we'll get started. You'll recall from the part 1 that we talked about Unitarian Universalism as being a living tradition. So I want to talk a little bit more about the reality of that because there have been a lot of changes since the original development of Unitarianism as a form of Christianity. So we talked on part 1 a little bit about salvation by character and the importance of that in separating Unitarianism from Congregationalism in New England, and how that original theology was important in supporting a move for social justice within Unitarian churches and by individual Unitarians and Universalists. So other developments in the 1800 to 1900 period, starting around 1840 or so, transcendentalism became an important factor in American culture, and this movement embraced nature and embraced individual decision-making and sources of knowledge, and downplayed the importance of materialism. This is actually a movement, an intellectual movement that really had its base within the Unitarian churches of the time, but they didn't get a great reception from the Unitarians of the time. Rather, there were a few leaders who advanced this new form of expression and thinking. Gradually over time they won, but it was a long time coming. So you might recognize Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, Theodore Parker, and many others involved in transcendentalism and its growing importance within Unitarianism during that century. Another thing that's clearly a differentiation between Unitarian Universalism and many other faith traditions is that for Unitarians and Universalists, science has always been a good thing, I guess is the way to put it. Early Unitarian Universalist scientists really viewed their work as revealing the mind of God. And they felt that people who didn't embrace science were, sort of willfully ignoring God's creation. So this is quite a contrast to many other churches who viewed science as something which was undermining their position in the world. We've talked a little bit about Joseph Priestley, Theodore Parker again, Hosea Ballou, and many others who felt that science was a way to understand the world better, and that was a world that, science was going to make things better for people and have a fuller understanding of the mind of God. In the late 1800s, there were many Unitarian Universalist ministers and lay persons who became interested in the other major religions of the world and felt that their values, that they would be of value in their own faith tradition. So there was a movement afoot to begin conversation with the other world religions. And the Unitarians of the time were deeply involved in creating the first World Parliament of Religions in 1893. And increasingly, the readings and sacred texts and insights from those other religious traditions came into Unitarian worship. And I would say that it was certainly common after World War II to have a more international and interfaith viewpoint of what are valuable insights. So I mentioned that the UUs, even early on, were embracing of science, and this is just a few of the folks who have been Unitarians and were important in that process. You'll probably recognize many of these people: Newton and Priestley, Buckminster Fuller, and Tim Berners-Lee. We have Benjamin Rush, who was actually the first Surgeon General of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. Lewis Latimer was an important early African-American inventor, worked on both the telephone and the light bulb. Charles Steinmetz, who was chief scientist for General Electric for many, many years. The minister, Theodore Parker, Margaret Fuller, Darwin, and Margaret Mitchell, who was a woman astronomer and one of the first to be accredited and to teach at university level. The process of theological evolution didn't stop in 1900, but continued, but I just divided up arbitrarily by century. Starting in the 1920s and a little later than that, Unitarians really came to embrace humanism, and many of the Unitarian ministers were involved in the creation of the Humanist Manifesto. Humanism was basically saying that ethics didn't have to be based on an outside force like God. They also embraced science, so that was very consistent already. They believe that ethics should be the proper focus of religious activity and thought. And many Unitarian Universalists congregations moved in that direction, and by the time I was growing up in the 50s, I would say this was a predominant view amongst Unitarian Universalists. In recent years, the separate Ethical Culture Society congregations, several of them have joined the UUA. In the mid-1900s, where it became more and more obvious that we were doing horrific damage to the ecological system, more and more UUs became interested in earth-based religious insights and also looking at the relationships between the philosophies of the first American Indian nations and the insights of ecological systems. So both of those elements have become more and more prominent in both worship and in associations. The seventh principle is really a manifestation of that emerging awareness. In the late 1990s and into the current century, a lot of congregations have found that they felt that they had sort of gone overboard on non-spiritual practice and intellectualism. So there's been more of an attempt to do some balance between them, develop religious practices that folks might embrace. So there's also been a lot of interest in bringing in Buddhist practices and Tai Chi and other elements from other cultures which help to provide balance in life. In the first half, we also mentioned how salvation by character, which was the viewpoint that was developed by Channing, became the theological basis for a lot of social justice work. And this occurred both for individuals and for congregations. There's been, an embrace of the civil rights movement, and of interest is, when President Obama and Reverend Martin Luther King talked about bending the arc of history towards justice, that famous quote is actually derived from a sermon that Theodore Parker gave in 1853 at the UU Church in Lexington, Massachusetts. And there are several organizations at the denominational level that are related to justice work. So there's the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, the UU office at the United Nations, the Siding with Love campaign. There's a UU College of Social Justice, which helps to train clergy and other folks in justice-related skills. And there are many specific national UU organizations that work on particular topics like the UU Ministry for Earth. So I'm not going to go over these, but so during the early periods, a lot of UUs worked on women's suffrage, humane treatment of the mentally ill, providing health, basically care for wounded soldiers, abolition, independence, public education, separation of church and state, child labor laws, and the prevention of cruelty to animals. So these are all topics which drew a lot of interest from Unitarians and Universalists during the early years. Here's just a few folks that you might recognize with pictures. All of them had their own specialties that they focused on, but there was also a great deal of understanding of intersectionality between these issues. And so many of these leaders were active in multiple justice areas. Again, things didn't stop in the justice area in the end of the 1800s, but rather have continued. So here's some other causes and Unitarians associated with those. Social Security, constitutional and civil rights, LGBTQ rights, and marriage equality, separation of church and state again, human rights, reverence for life, the anti-Nazi movements, and basically attempt to secure the safety of persecuted peoples, immigrant rights, legal defense of animal rights, environmental work, anti-McCarthyism, reproductive rights, economic justice and social work, and peace and nonviolence, and many more. But this just gives you sort of an array of some of the things which have drawn the attention and life work of Unitarian Universalists. And so here's the honor roll from more recent times. Reverend John Haynes Holmes is an interesting character because he was involved in founding both the NAACP and the ACLU. He was a conscientious objector and went through a lot of misery because of his pacifist orientation during the First World War. A. Powell Davies, which is the next person on the top, was the minister at All Souls in Washington, D.C., and was one of the first persons to work for racial integration in the District of Columbia. And also he was a bitter political foe of McCarthy. Whitney Young, president of CORE, active in the civil rights era. Actually, all around the outside edge here are the folks that are still with us. We have Zach Walls, active in Scouting for All. You probably will recognize Dr. Scott Warren, who was just recently acquitted of helping immigrants not die of thirst in the desert in Arizona. We have Tim DeChristopher in the bottom right. He was someone who disrupted one of the attempts to sell rights to do oil exploration in the national parks. And Hillary Goodrich was one of the folks who sued the state of Massachusetts to allow same-sex couples to marry. Also down the bottom row is Rachel Carson, who wrote the famous Silent Spring book, which has really launched a lot of the ecological work that we are active in today. Reverend James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo were two Unitarian Universalists who were murdered during the civil rights era, and their martyrdom has been an important part of the story of allying in a serious way with groups who are marginalized. So in 1961, the Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America joined to create the UUA, or the Unitarian Universalist Association. There have been several decades of cooperation between the two groups leading up to the merger, but the merger actually took place in 1961. I just mentioned before that UUs were extremely active in the civil rights struggles of the 1960s. Shortly after the merger and after the civil rights movement had achieved its legislative victories, the UUA became embroiled in the Vietnam War conflict, and there's a Unitarian Universalist publishing house called Beacon Press, who published the Pentagon Papers, and they came under a great deal of financial and legal threats during the period before Nixon left the White House. And this was a pretty desperate time. In the mid-1980s, the UUA developed the Statement of Principles and Sources, and it was widely and gratefully received within UU congregations as a way of basically unifying a lot of the thinking which had been going on for some period of time. So here we have a few pictures from that era. The first picture on the left is the actual ceremony which joined the two denominations. At the bottom left-hand corner, we have Martin Luther King, along with Homer Jack and Dana Greeley, who was the president of the UUA. And the next picture on the right, in the lower level, is Senator Mike Gravel and Robert West, who was the president of the UUA at the time, at their press conference announcing publication of the Pentagon Papers. And the circle is basically just a different representation of the 7 principles. So I want to give you just a little bit of background about the UUA. The UUA has elected officers and an elected board of trustees. They are all elected by congregational delegates at the annual UU General Assembly. GA, as we call it, is usually a 5-day conference open to all UUs, but there are official delegates from the different congregations who vote at the various business sessions. UUs are, UU congregations are organized geographically so that there are staff to support congregations in each area. And this is a map of the regions. There used to be 21 districts, and now they've been consolidated into regions. Some of them still retain, smaller divisions as well, but this is the general map these days. I said there are a little over 1,000 UU congregations, and this is kind of the spread geographically. And you can see that New England continues to be one of the areas with more UU churches than average because of the historic routes. The South and the Southeast are areas with relatively small UU presence, but it's growing there, probably faster than in other areas. So that's the general picture. Some of these organizations I mentioned before, but it's worthwhile that you at least hear the names. So there's the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. That's the independent world relief organization. They really focus on helping marginalized communities that other similar organizations overlook. The UU World is the quarterly UUA magazine, which is sent to most church members. Beacon Press is the publishing arm of the UUA. There's an important UU office at the United Nations, which developed originally through the work of Adlai Stevenson, who was a Unitarian and encouraged the Unitarian Universalist Association to establish an office there. Currently, the UN office is one of the organizations which really has had an effect on promoting LGBTQIA rights on the international level. You'll probably hear about Starr King and Meadville Lombard. These are the 2 seminaries where UU ministers are trained. Those are the ones which are supported by the denomination, and there's a half dozen other seminaries around the country that train UU ministers, including, of course, Harvard Divinity School because of its original historic ties. The Veach Foundation is an important source of funding for UU organizations, and they're actually the group that kind of rescued the UUA during the Pentagon Papers episodes. There's an International Council of Unitarian Universalists, which is the way that we connect to the other Unitarian groups around the world. And then we're also a member of the International Association for Religious Freedom. This is a large organization with members from most of the areas of the world, and they're all united in trying to protect the freedom of religion around the world. Many times there'll be pictures in the world of the Dalai Lama meeting with the UUA president, and that's all usually associated with the International Association for Religious Freedom. These are just a few pictures of the UU presidents over the years, because you may see pictures or read articles by each of them. They're still active except for Dana Greeley. So Susan Frederick-Gray is the current president. She was elected a couple of years ago, and her term is a 6-year term. William Sinkford is currently the senior minister at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Portland, Oregon. Peter Morales was the president before Susan Frederick-Gray, and he's well known for starting up the Siding with Love program. One of the things that you may see if you anytime go to a demonstration in which Unitarians participate, I'll be wearing these golden yellow shirts which say Siding with Love on them, and that's the program which he developed. William Scholes was president of the UUA, but you may know him more from his role as the executive director of Amnesty International. And then subsequent to that, he was the executive director of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. And Dana Greeley is shown here. He was actually the last president of the American Unitarian Association and the first president of the UUA. So he's an important figure historically. Then I just want to remind you of a few UU traditions which you may come in contact with that are it's nice to know about. So the flower communion is something which was developed in Czechoslovakia by Reverend Norbert Capek. And the flower communion is basically where all the members of the congregation bring a flower, and then at the end of the worship, they each take a different flower home. And he was basically trying to, have something which would be community building and a religious practice which wasn't the same as regular communion in the Christian church. Capek is important person for writing hymns as well as flower communion. His story is a very sad one at the end. He had lived in the United States before he went to Czechoslovakia. He stayed in Czechoslovakia at the start of World War II. Was arrested by the Gestapo and murdered by them. Chalice lighting is a ceremony which many UU churches have at the beginning of the service. Light a chalice and say some words about it, and then at the end of the service, it's closed, extinguished. I mentioned the Siding with Love campaign. These are folks, including Susan Frederick-Gray, with the yellow shirts, or in her case, with the yellow stole. Music is a really active part in many UU congregations, and it serves the double purpose of helping in worship and also being a rallying cry for justice work. So here's a few of the folks who have been very active in that part of the development of Unitarian practice. We met the flaming chalice before. It was developed for the Unitarian Service Committee during the first part of World War II. The Sharps, who I mentioned before, were the two Unitarians who were sent, or basically went to Prague to help to try to save folks from Nazi persecution. Once the war started, they moved their operations to Lisbon, Portugal, which is a neutral area, and they were able to rescue many thousands of Jews and other persecuted groups from both Czechoslovakia and other parts of Europe. They are two of the 5 Americans who are recognized by the State of Israel for their work to save the Jews during World War II. At the bottom is the current UU logo, which is sort of an adaptation of the flaming chalice design. If you see official things from the UUA, they will tend to bear that logo. As I mentioned, there are UU congregations in much of the world. The most common, the places where the most churches are in the US and Canada, UK, India, the Philippines, Romania, Hungary, and Australia. And the most active persecution of UUs currently going on in the world is in Burundi. And if you are around the UU circles for a while, you may end up coming in contact with Reverend Fulgence, who was the founder of the UU Church in Burundi, and his church was sacked, he was kidnapped, and he was imprisoned, and he managed to get out finally with help of various UUs around the world, and he's now working in Canada as an intern at the Saskatoon congregation, and he's still waiting to be reunited with his family. So it's been a trial of many years for him. And these are just a few miscellaneous shots that I thought I would mention to you. So you may or may not know that President Obama's mother was a Unitarian. In fact, she went to East Shore Unitarian Church. The middle picture there on the top row is just a picture with the Siding or Standing with Love banner, but also recognizing that many churches try to do things to be more ecologically minded, and solar panels are one of the ones that come to mind. There are several interesting and ongoing folks in American culture who are identified as Unitarian. Alan Alda's one of them. Alex Capitan, which is the person on the far right on the first row, is very active in transgender rights work at the UUA and with UU congregations. There's an ongoing work with other Unitarians around the world. That's the group at a workshop on the second row. Probably should know there's a UU Commission on Institutional Change, which is the group which reports to the UUA board about racial justice work, and both within the denomination and outside it. I mentioned General Assemblies, and this is something I really recommend that you do if you get involved with your congregation. General Assembly is generally a very inspirational and music-filled and worshipful and very informative set of meetings every year. Just a great thing to get involved with at some point. I mentioned that interest in ecological issues and the environment is important. And the picture on the bottom row on the far left is from the last General Assembly in Portland, which was a couple years ago. And it focused on relationships with the first American Indian nations. And this was one of the public witness events with that theme. Ellie Tharp is the executive director for the UU Ministry of Earth. You'll probably see her around if you're active in UU things. The last picture on the far right on the bottom row is just a view of the Unitarian Church in San Francisco. It's important to remember that we operate under congregational polity. We cooperate with each other, but congregational polity remains the rock on which the church is organized. And then are you UU too? That's my question for you, I guess. This ends our time together. I want to thank you for listening. May peace be with you in the future. And as a parting part of the program, I want to share with you this musical piece sung by the Children's Choir of Chicago, which was organized in 1956 at the First Unitarian Church of Chicago. The choir is now an independent organization and serves almost 5,000 singers annually, many from the public inner-city schools of Chicago. Here the choir is joined by some of the older generation to sing One Day.
For
Peace be with you, and thank you for joining us.